The first thing that came to mind when I read the whole article was that they highlighted significantly successful and well-known white celebrities. However, there was no mentioning of Layla Ali, Paul George. And this is all information that I've been put out there on the internet that's easily accessible. I have been in correspondence with Skip. I think it would have been a perfect time to really collaborate to put a little bit more gravy on those mashed potatoes.
What if the story you've been told about your family is only half the story? And what if the other half was hiding in plain sight or buried in the archives? Today, I'm going to be joined by my cousin, Alex Lee. He's not just family, but he's a person who's been quietly uncovering chapters of our shared history. And we're going to talk about the Pope's shared history, his Creole ancestry in this video, and some of the stories that don't make it into the televised or printed genealogy specials.
I'm Alex DePauli Sr. I'm founder of Alex Genealogy, which is a growing platform, as well as the founder of SWOGR, Southwest Louisiana Genealogy Researchers. I'm a native of Beaumont, Texas. No, I'm not a Native American. I'm of Native American, and I have Native American ancestry, but when I say Native, I was born in Beaumont, Texas, which is I like to say Louisiana, the continuation of Louisiana. I have ties just about in all Southwest Louisiana. My family was originally from New Orleans, but just as everybody else family, they migrated to Southwest Louisiana.
Yep. And we're related, probably a few different ways.
Our family, you and I are definitely related. And what's interesting about our family relation, I say this all the time. When my ancestor, Mary Ann, got married to Martin Donata, Danielle's ancestor gave $100 to that as a wedding gift. So we're here now sharing the world our story simply because I saw a photo of my great grandfather and I thought he was white, a Native American. You saw a photo of your ancestor and then you learned that she was of African descent. So it's kind of like our stories have been both impactful and we definitely inspire people. And that's one of the reasons why I'm going to be putting out a lot of publishings. And I'm currently working on a book now, The Affluent Women of Color in St. Landry Parish. That's definitely going to be to where I'm breaking things down like Mary John of how this woman was able to obtain her wealth as well as her progeny became some of the most prosperous and affluent Creoles of color in Louisiana history.
We were having a lot of conversations over the last couple of weeks about the Pope. And I had mentioned in another video that we were going to do a video together on this. And so a lot of people are curious about the Pope's genealogy. And I think a lot of people are claiming the Pope, like a lot of different groups are claiming the Pope. Skip Gates just covered it, right? And so can you tell me what Skip put out there? This is Dr. Gates from Finding Your Roots. What he put out there and how many more pages probably could have been put in that article about the Pope? Because, Skip only had so much space, I'm sure. And I'm assuming they're thinking, who are people that the broad audience is going to recognize? They're going to recognize the name Hillary Clinton, Madonna, Justin Bieber. That's cool. It's exciting. And I think it is exciting. Like I'm saying, he just feels like the most American. But I think what's also exciting is people don't know any of this. And now it's coming into the conversation of like, well, what is a Creole? What's a Louisiana Creole? How could he not know that he's a Louisiana Creole? That's pretty niche. And so to be able to have it about the Pope, who I would say is probably the most well-known figure in the world right now.
Absolutely.
Amazing.
And it's a huge plus for us to get the exposure that we deserve. And, speaking of which, I definitely can understand and relate to that. There's only a certain amount of information that you can put into these articles. Yeah. I'm talking about people don't understand the work that it takes to prove this. I say one of the things that I definitely was disappointed about was that although they mentioned Justin Bieber, Madonna, Hillary Clinton, they didn't mention anybody with a little color. They didn't mention the Pope closer ties with public figures such as Layla Ali, who was probably one of the greatest names in women boxing ever, with her father being a legend, Paul George, NBA superstar, Suzanne Malvo. One of the most significant things, in my opinion, too, was federal judge Ivan Lamel, who is still in New Orleans, who has his name Lamel. So you have a lot of significant people who
Mm.
have accomplished a lot of amazing things through the LaMelle line that I feel like they could have been mentioned, but they weren't mentioned. I think it would have balanced the article off, and it would have at least acknowledged the fact of the Pope having close ties to some of the Creoles of color out there,
Right.
or Black people that has close Louisiana Creole ties, especially with his family. We're talking about they're not that far removed, considering the fact that when you look at the Pope's ancestry, that Celeste Lamille was only, I believe, his great grandmother or great great grandmother. I can't remember off the top of my head, but that's not very far when you
No.
look at the family tree of these people, because their great grandparents are Lamilles, and then when you look at how close they are in relation, a lot of the families who are related to Lamilles are related in a multiple of ways. So,
Right.
um, just like with cousin Suzanne Malvo's tree and Ivan, they related to the Pope almost three different times through the Lamelles. I have been in correspondence with Skip. I think it would have been a perfect time to really collaborate to put a little bit more gravy on those mashed potatoes. But I think he did him and his team did a great job with sharing more extensive information regarding the Pope's ancestry. I know they kind of went back a few more generations that went beyond some of the work that Jari Honore and I had put out. I know we were among the earliest genealogists to come up with information regarding the Pope's ancestry, but I think they did a good job with actually laying out more information and kind of getting to the facts, providing documents. But as far as the Lamelle branch, which is where I come into play with them having ties to St. Landry Parish, which is my area of expertise, I feel that they could have actually named some of the slaves that were owned by Mary Jo, and also talk about what became of those people. I think a lot of times when we're doing this work, they focus on the free people of color, but a lot of times they forget about the slaves that belong to the free people of color. So our group has been identifying who these people were and who their descendants are today. And I feel like they could have been named. Like I know I have an inventory with some of the slaves that Mary Jo owned, Eve, with her children, and significantly, the one of the slaves that were mentioned in the last will and testament of Mary Jo, who was the Pope's direct ancestor, she gave and bequeathed to her daughter Catherine a mulatto slave by the name of Andronette. And what's significant about Andronette is that her and her sister Epiphany, they were liberated at some point. They were purchased by the fathers of their children, their enslaved children. So, I feel like they could have added more gravy on the mashed potatoes, talking about that aspect of those mulatto slaves being her grandchildren. Because, myself and other researchers have delved into this. I know one, Darius Traps, Alex Traps. I know me and him met early on and collaborated on some of the information on that part of the family tree in which he descends from through Charles Moran. They just have some very interesting stories that I feel could have added a layer of what was really going on with these women. For example, the Pope's ancestor, Celeste Lamelle, she did a lot of significant things, in my opinion. I know when you look at New Orleans genealogy and how they were socially, they have a very high expectation, but somebody coming from St. Landry Parish, going into New Orleans and seeing some of the things that the relatives and the extended families were doing was just very amazing to me. And apparently these people were movers and shakers, or what we would call movers and shakers. I know the white man that she had children with were very present. Some of them were even on some of the property transactions that Celeste Lamille had, and she had a lot of property transactions. And one of them, one of the agents, or typically who we would call an overseer, actually took one of her slaves and hid with this slave. I got a court case involved in that. So there's a lot of different things that I've been able to
Wow.
look at in the records to show you that these women were business women. They weren't just regular women. It's too often that you look at movies and they depict the women as being
Yeah.
struggling or just mistresses, but nobody talk about
Mm.
the brilliance that a lot of these women had, in order to definitely, in most cases, manipulate these men into being given their freedom as well as their children.
Right.
I think that is I think we kind of missed the mark there. A lot of people missed the mark
Mm.
in expressing that aspect of going back in time and looking to the women in the early 17th and 18th centuries.
So let me ask you, a couple weeks ago, I read an article about the Pope's brother. I think he might live in Florida, but I'm not sure. It's one of his brothers. And he was saying that, I mean, this was right when everything kind of opened up. He was saying that they grew up seeing themselves as Italian and French, and they had never heard of any of this stuff. And that's, his grandparents, their grandparents, the Pope and his brother's grandparents were from the 7th Ward, though, right? Which is like a historically Black neighborhood in New Orleans. But these boys supposedly didn't know anything about that. Can you talk on that a little bit? Like, is that common? Because I know, like, for me, I'm like, oh, that sounds like my family. But like, how do you have all these women who are doing these things in New Orleans? They're well known. The Lamels, well known, very successful family. The family moves up to Chicago, maybe during the Great Migration, and suddenly nobody knows anything anymore.
Well, to be honest with you, especially reaching out and reconnecting with a lot of these families, that is actually very common, in the Creole communities, and not just the Creole communities. I've heard stories regarding this in general with families that have assimilated in society as white that may come from a background of mixed race ancestry, much like the Pope as well as yours. I feel that when you're around a community, especially that has been of having these mixed race relationships to a point to where these people could pretty much assimilate in society as white if they move out the community. In my opinion, one of the reasons why some of the people know they were not fully white in the community is because they know the families. But if these people move to just different neighborhoods, communities, or outside of where they were born, pretty much a lot of these people would be regarded as white. I even noticed something very significant in the early documentation that they didn't have labels of some of the families that I know were free people of color.
Mhm.
And some of the early documents, they are not even labeled with their free status. So it kind of showed me that how we view things today, and this is a term that was used by Jari, I kind of like it, presentism.
Mm.
We only look at things of how they are viewed today, but when you look back into the early records, you can see that there's a huge difference of how these people navigated through these systems and who was called black or white. Because when you look beyond the Civil War, and you look in the records prior to that, you can see that these families were doing a lot of business with each other, regardless of what race they were.
Mhm.
So when you look at that, and me knowing that history, I look at things completely different because, as we know, race is a social construct. So wherever you
Mm.
go, if somebody don't know your background, then you can pretty much assimilate however. You know what I mean? Like that's just one of those things in our families of, especially, it was accepted to basically have a mixed race union.
Mhm.
So it's basically it was accepted in our society in Louisiana. Especially when you talk about that, it was accepted in the society of Louisiana. That's why you have all of these families when you go back that they only have black descendants with the French last names. Why is that?
So, what kind of a collaboration would you like to see happen then? Maybe between researchers like yourself. I'm much more of like a platform storyteller. Skip Gates, like, I feel like we should be able to collaborate in a way that maybe we can reach a new audience, explore stuff that maybe isn't as mainstream, but that's okay, right? Like it's not Justin Bieber level, but like it's still interesting. What kind of collaboration would you want to see? Like, can we invite Skip Gates to do something with us?
That'd be a great idea. Me personally, I have been in correspondence with Dr. Gates. So I would have wished that they would
Mm,
have gotten with me to help them out with the project or at least collaborate because if you even Google the Lamel, I want you to do that too so the people can see that on
mhm.
your end.
I will.
Google the Lamel family, you're gonna be referenced to the things that I've already put out there years ago before Pope Leo's election. Like that
Mhm.
was information I've already put. I'm very close with the family. Obviously, they're relatives of mine. I'm in touch with the people today that my family have dealt with. Like, in fact, looking at that last will and testament of Mary Jean, guess who was one of the witnesses of that last will and testament? My
Oh,
ancestor, Baptiste Mayon.
wow.
So I have like so many different family ties with the Lamel family.
Yeah.
So I thought it would have been very important that we could have collaborated. They would have learned more about the community, at least visit some of those people who have that Lamel name today. And that's another significant
Mhm.
thing when you look at Louisiana Creole families is that these Frenchmen came, but they only have black families with those French last names. They don't have any white descendants today.
Mm,
They're all people of color or black people. If you hear anybody in the country that has the Lamel name,
mm.
that family name can be traced back to Louisiana in the early 1700s, and the name has been passed down biologically for the most part from the direct French ancestor, Mr. Francois Lamel. A lot of people like to say that it's a product of. That's not necessarily true when you look into the documentation
Yeah.
and you can see, especially with some of the depositions that I have of the plantation owners as well as the children and people in the community. A lot of these people had open relationships, and believe it or not, these women, in most cases, well, I'm gonna say in some cases because I know people like to tear me apart with that. They picked and chose who they wanted to be with. Like I have the genealogy of probably one of the famous Creole musicians, Amadé Ordwin. His grandmother actually had relations with a mixed race man during slavery, as well as a black man or a Negro man. And in the record, the mixed race man, who was the Ordwin man, he said that basically he took that woman from her first husband, who was a Bushnell. And what's interesting about that is that he also mentioned that he left him for the plantation manager, who was a friend.
Oh, well,
And the plantation owner actually confirmed all of this. And I'm like,
it's
that's
scandalous.
making yeah, it made me look at things completely different because once again, I feel like it's not a lot of things out there, especially when you look at the big picture, Hollywood movies, they don't depict. It's like he hit everything. Like when you think of what it is to be American, what it is, much like what it is to be a person of Creole ancestry. Those kind of records that are in my database. Matter of fact, do you mind if I actually show
Yeah,
you that document?
yeah, please.
The succession of Mary Jean Lemel. This is the Pope's direct ancestor. So this is Celeste Lemel's grandmother, the one that I pretty much put out there to the world. Now, a thing that I questioned in that article was they said that she had 20 slaves. However, according to the succession and probate records that I have, she only had 9, and this is a list of them right here. Two, a Negro man by the name of Jean Pierre, aged about 40 years, appraised at 800. A Negro man named Jean, aged about 47, appraised at 800, and a Negro woman named Eva, 30 years, with her 3 children, Shidoni, aged about 9, Alcin, aged about 6, Cone, aged about 2 years, and then you have The fifth, a mulatto girl named Andronette, aged about 16 years, appraised at 700. And then you have a mulatto, Epiphany, was aged about 12 years, appraised at $500.
Wow.
Now, just looking at that list, they only list 9, but I was able to identify that Epiphany and Andronette were Lamels. They were actually biologically Lamel and connected to this family. And that's probably why in this record they have her last will in which she gave Andronette to her daughter, Catherine. So, when I look at that, I was like, out of all of the slaves that she had on this plantation, why did she specifically chose Andronette to be given to her daughter, Catherine? So those are some of the pieces that you look at when you're dealing with this kind of research, try to figure out what is the relationship or why would she do that, bequeath Andronette to her daughter. And I believe at the time of her last will and testament, I believe Andronette was she was a couple of years old. Let me find her last will and testament.
Let me ask you while you're pulling this up. So for these documents, I know you and I talked about it off of camera before, but just for everybody else, what did these documents tell us about the wealth and power and how it was kind of moving through both women and mixed race families? Because I feel like this kind of flies in the face, like you were saying, of how we're taught history of the South. Like, you don't see this. Is this common? Is this a Louisiana thing?
I believe I'm going to go with Louisiana because that's what I'm most familiar with. I have heard stories of the Carolinas and the Virginias having powerful families of color. But of course, that goes unspoken and is not exemplified in any films, in my opinion. So that's why it's important. The time is now to kind of educate people that you did have some very powerful and wealthy families of color. And some of these families own more slaves than white people. And it's also a common belief that the only reason why these families of color owned slaves was because they were protecting family. That is definitely not the case. As you know, as you see in this succession, I mentioned those slaves were listed as Negro. They were not listed as mulatto. So that's an indication for me that these people were most likely they were not family, or at least close family, or if family at all. So those are things that I know it's an uncomfortable truth, but it's something that needs to be expressed and told so people could understand that you did have a social hierarchy back then, and unfortunately, you had the whites, you had the free people of color, and you had the slaves. More so a physical descriptor of the people, so you can kind of identify who did have mixed race ancestry. And I can tell you this now because some people think that mulattoes or quadroons were worth more. No, it was just skill. Like having studied thousands of records at this point and translated and transcribed, the price of the people were based on the skill of the parent. It was not based on physical description. It was based on the skill. For example, you would see that carpenters or cattlemen actually had a higher price value than the average slave. So understanding that, you could see that so many people have created these narratives that are just not true, in my opinion.
And this is all connected to the Pope's family right here, what we see.
Right. This is actually the last will and testament of Mary Joan Lamel, who had children with Mr. Francois Lamel, who bore the Pope direct ancestor, Louis Lamel, who was the father of Celeste. Now, I want to talk about that because I feel that before the information was put out there and me doing the NBC segment with Maya Eaglin, people really didn't have the documentation, in my opinion. They just pretty much ran with things that they saw on Ancestry. And I want to share with you a little bit more in depth of what I mean by that, because I've been seeing people put out a lot of articles way before they put out the documentation. And I'm like, first and foremost, how y'all were able to identify that the Pope's ancestor was Celeste Lemire. How did you know that for sure? And I'm gonna have to show you how extensive I had to go in order for me to find that information. All of the details, like I literally had to do a high level of research. The reason being, the Pope ancestor, Celeste Lemire, she was not married, or at least not to our knowledge.
Mm.
So therefore, she don't have a record that would list her parents in any marriage records, right?
Okay.
Because she was the consort, or she had these relationships with these white men, but they didn't get legally married. So how could you identify the parents, and how would you know for sure that that is the Pope's ancestor? You follow me?
I'm following you. I'm trying to think, what would you do? I mean, I guess I would maybe look for a baptism record, but I don't know if you get that if you have an illegitimate child. I don't know what happens.
So here's the deal. You could actually find the baptism of the Pope's ancestor Celeste's children. That's possible, right? But I haven't done that. I did the quicker way. So remember when I mentioned that she was a mover and shaker?
Mhm.
That meant that she had lots of courthouse documentations.
So you're seeing her.
So basically, seeing her in these documents, what does one have to do whenever they do anything legal? They have to get the signature.
Mm.
So now that I feel that everybody already have the information out there, now I feel a lot more comfortable sharing this with you on your platform of the measures and the critiquous measures that I had to go through in order to successfully prove that this was the same Celeste Lemire that was listed as a child of Louis Lemire and Celeste Olympe.
And this looks like it's in French. You speak French, you can read it and write it at least, right? You can translate
Right.
it.
So this record is in French, and this is her, who we would call in today's term her baby daddy, Mr. Francois Simon.
A
And
beautiful
you see her
document.
name right here?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it is. Now look at how Celeste wrote her signature. This document is dated 1850, May 31st, 1850.
Oh.
And this is a sale of a lot. So as you can see, her child's father was present in this document in 1850. And you see her signature right there. So now I'm going to look at another document of the other Celeste Lemire with her siblings, in which you could see her signature. She had a very beautiful signature.
Wow, look at that. That is so pretty, that document.
Okay, this is an early one. Now, this record, she didn't write her signature on here, but they had a white man who gave her the capital from his gambling house in New Orleans. And in the document, they mentioned that right here, Celeste, the child of the widow of Louis Lemire. So I thought that was really significant that when you look back in 1833, December the 27th is when this transaction happened. A white man is donating her the capital of his gambling house.
Why would he do that?
Obviously, they had some kind of relationship.
Some kind of a...
And significantly, it was probably somebody that may have family ties or was an associate of the family. I haven't figured that part out yet. But keep in mind, the Pope's ancestor was named Frederic Guimont. And this guy here, who I did find was a tutor of the family, Ferdinand Gaillard.
It's amazing. I'm amazed that you can read it in French. That's amazing. So let me ask you, my Zoom at least is saying I have 4 minutes left on here, but I feel good about what we've got. But I do want to ask you, what do you hope happens with this story going forward? Like, a lot has been left out, but I feel like maybe there's a lot more interest.
More conversations around Louisiana Creoles. I think people need to understand that we're not about a color. Anytime somebody mentions the name Creole outside of Louisiana, they're going to think of Haiti, of course, or they're going to think of Black people who don't want to be Black. That is not the case.
Right. Oh, yeah. I've seen that so much. Even me, when I've used that word, and I don't call myself Creole, but I will say, like, I have Creole heritage, that people will be like, well, it's because you don't want to be Black. I'm like, really? Am I? What? Like, but that is a conversation that is...
That's definitely the reputation of the Creoles, and I think, Danielle, because that's why it's important for we let the audience know that we're going to have our own show to where we're talking about genealogy and things related to our family. You and I are definitely related. And what's interesting about our family relation, I say this all the time. When my ancestor, Mary Ann, got married to Martin Donata, Danielle's ancestor gave $100 to that as a wedding gift. So
You're
we're here
welcome.
now sharing the world our story simply because I saw a photo of my great grandfather and I thought he was white, a Native American. You saw a photo of your ancestor and then you learned that she was of African descent. So it's kind of like our stories have been both impactful and we definitely inspiring people. And that's one of the reasons why I'm going to be putting out a lot of publishings. And I'm currently working on a book now, The Affluent Women of Color in St. Landry Parish. That's definitely going to be to where I'm
Awesome.
breaking things down like Mary John of how this woman was able to obtain her wealth as well as her progeny became some of the most prosperous and affluent Creoles of color in Louisiana history.
All right, let me ask you, Alex, before this thing, because it has like a minute and a half left before it's going to kick me off. But this is amazing. How can people connect with you who either have Creole heritage, they might have Creole heritage, they're interested in Creole heritage? How can they get connected with you and what you're doing?
They can follow me on my platform. I got a website, alexgenealogy.com. Pretty much all of my handles on social media is Alex Genealogy
Mhm.
or Creole Alex. And I definitely look forward to collaborating with people. That's what my research, the basis of my research is connecting with families.